He was denied a ride, called a fanatic, and publicly humiliated because of a bright red Maga hat, as if it were a mark of guilt. The driver abandoned the car in front of dozens of onlookers, shouting furiously that people like him were not welcome here. No one knew this insignificant customer was the head of an entire transport corporation. But what happened next taught the driver a lesson he would never forget. Chicago buzzed with life. Car horns echoed through the streets, jazz musicians played on the sidewalks, and pedestrians rushed about their business. John Reynolds, a tall, fit man with broad shoulders and a commanding presence, stepped out of a glass skyscraper, having just concluded a strategic meeting with investors. He looked composed but relaxed. His dark suit fit him perfectly, and the bright red Maga hat on his head starkly contrasted with his formal demeanor, drawing curious glances from passers-by. John stepped to the curb, pulled out his phone, and hailed a taxi via an app. Surveying the evening cityscape, he noted that Chicago never seemed to lose its energy, even during rush hour. Within minutes, a car arrived, a sleek black sedan with a slight gleam on its hood. The driver, a young man in his early 30s with closely cropped blonde hair and a sharp gaze, glanced out the window, his eyes immediately locking on John's hat. "Are you serious with that hat?" the driver sneered, giving John an appraising look. John, accustomed to such reactions, simply nodded. "Absolutely. Are we going?" The driver froze for a moment, his face contorted with disdain. Then, with a dramatic roll of his eyes, he yanked the gear stick into park and leaned back in his seat, arms crossed. "No, you can forget about it," he said loudly enough for bystanders to hear. "I'm not driving a Trump fanatic. Find another ride." John raised an eyebrow, remaining calm outwardly, though irritation flared within. "Listen, it's just a hat. Your personal views shouldn't affect your job." But the driver seemed eager to escalate. His voice rose. "A hat? A hat! That hat is a symbol of hate. You're a Republican fanatic. People like you are ruining this country." A small crowd began to gather, drawn by the commotion. Someone in the crowd pulled out a phone, hoping to capture a viral moment. "Get out of here before I call the cops!" the driver yelled, his face flushed with anger. "You're not wanted here." John sighed, maintaining his outward composure, though his patience was wearing thin. He stepped aside, took out his phone, and discreetly recorded the car's license plate. Then he turned back to the driver, smiling slightly. "You're right. I'll find another way. Have a good evening." He walked away, feeling the weight of the crowd's stares, but never once looking back. The next day, John walked into his spacious office with panoramic windows overlooking Chicago's business district. He often said the view inspired his best strategic decisions. On his desk awaited a stack of documents and a steaming cup of coffee, prepared by his assistant, Carl, a short man with an ever-present wide grin. "John, you look focused today. Everything all right?" Carl asked, handing him the cup. John settled into his chair and took a small sip before responding. "Let's just say I had yet another encounter with stupidity and bias yesterday." He briefly recounted the incident with the taxi driver, mentioning how his Maga hat had sparked the conflict. "You're kidding," Carl chuckled. "And what did you do?" "Not much. Yet. But we're going to fix that," John replied, setting down his cup and opening his laptop. His fingers quickly typed the car's license plate number into the company database. As the CEO of one of the largest transportation corporations in the U.S., John had access to every driver operating under the company's franchise agreements. Within seconds, he found the driver's name. "Mark Johnson, 32 years old. Works with us under a partner agreement. Take a look at this." John turned the monitor toward Carl, showing a record of 3 prior complaints against Mark for rude behavior toward clients. "Quite the history he's got," Carl said, shaking his head. "But why didn't you tell him who you were, John? You could have shut him down right there." John leaned back in his chair, smiling. "Because that would have been too easy. He needs to learn his lesson the right way. We're organizing a meeting for all regional drivers. It's time to show that bias has consequences." Carl nodded in agreement, already anticipating that John would handle this as stylishly as always. The large conference room, designed to hold 100 people, buzzed with murmurs. Drivers shuffled in, grumbling about wasted time. Among them was Mark Johnson, seated at the back, fiddling irritably with a baseball cap in his hands. "Why are we here again?" he muttered to a colleague. "Another lecture on high standards? They act like we're robots, not people." Mark glanced up as a man in a sharp suit stepped onto the stage. His attention was immediately drawn to the bright red Maga hat the speaker wore. "Who's this joker?" Mark mumbled, frowning. He didn't recognize John from their brief encounter. John strode confidently to the microphone, surveying the room with a steady gaze before beginning. "Good afternoon, everyone. Today we're not just here to talk about work standards. We're here to address professionalism, respect, and why bias has no place in our company." The room quieted. John's voice was calm but firm. "Recently, I experienced a situation that demonstrated how damaging prejudice and rudeness can be. One of our drivers refused service to a customer based on personal assumptions, not professionalism." The drivers exchanged uneasy glances. "Such behavior doesn't just violate our standards, it tarnishes our entire company's reputation. What do you think should happen to a driver like that?" Mark, smirking, spoke up loudly. "Fire him, obviously. Let him find a job where he can act like a jerk." John's piercing gaze fixed on Mark, his expression serious. "Exactly right," John replied. "And that driver is sitting in this room." Mark's grin faltered. "Allow me to introduce myself," John said, removing his hat. "I'm John Reynolds, your CEO." A murmur rippled through the room, followed by silence. Mark's face turned pale as he realized the speech was about him. After the meeting, Mark was summoned to a private office. His eyes darted nervously around the room, and his hands trembled. When the door opened, John entered, shutting it behind him before taking a seat across from Mark. "Do you understand why you're here?" John asked calmly. Mark nodded, unable to meet John's gaze. "Your actions weren't just unprofessional. They damaged our company's reputation. If this had happened to someone else, not me, we could have lost contracts or faced legal issues." Mark stammered. I didn't mean to." "You didn't give yourself a chance to know the customer," John interrupted. "You made assumptions based on a hat." Mark fell silent, realizing excuses were pointless. John continued. "However, I believe people can change. You have two options: resign or complete mandatory training on customer service, bias, and accountability." Mark clenched his fists, wrestling with his pride, but eventually nodded. "I'll take the training." "Good," John said. "But understand, one more violation and you're out." Days later, the company issued a public statement condemning bias and reaffirming its commitment to equal treatment of all clients. John recorded a personal video message about the incident, without naming Mark, urging employees to remember their responsibilities. The video went viral, garnering millions of views and supportive comments like, "This guy's a real leader. It's not about the hat, it's about respect. John Reynolds, you're the boss everyone needs." Mark, despite his humiliation, learned from the experience. Months later, he completed the training and became noticeably more respectful toward clients. John, observing from a distance, smiled, knowing that sometimes the best victory is offering someone the chance to grow.